History of Israel, Chistovers, an area of the southern Levant, also known as Canaanith N, Palestine, or the Holy Land, which is the geographical location of the modern states of Israel and Palestine. From a prehistory as part of Thea to the emergence of Nachafian culture c. 10th millennium BCE, the region entered the Bronze Age c. 2000 BCE with the development of Canaanite civilization, before being vassalized by Egypt in the late Bronze Age. In the Iron Age, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were established, entities that were central to the origins of the Jewish and Samaritan peoples, as well critical Levantine corridor, which witnessed waves of early humans out of Africa as the Abrahamic faith tradition. This has given rise to Judaism, Samaritanism, Christianity, Islam, Druzism, Baha'ism, and a variety of other religious movements. Throughout the course of human history, the land of Israel has seen many conflicts and come under the sway or control of various polities, and, as a result, it has historically hosted a wide variety of ethnic groups. In the following centuries, the Assyrian, Babylonian, Achaemenid, and Macedonian empires conquered the region. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids vied for control over the region during the Hellenistic period. However, with the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, the local Jewish population maintained independence for a century before being incorporated into the Roman Republic. As a result of the Jewish-Roman wars in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, many Jews were killed, displaced, or sold into slavery. Following the advent of Christianity, which was adopted by the Greco-Roman world under the influence of the Roman Empire, the region's demographics shifted towards newfound Christians, who replaced Jews as the majority of the population by the 4th century. However, shortly after Islam was consolidated across the Arabian Peninsula under Muhammad in the 7th century, Byzantine Christian rule over the land of Israel was superseded in the Muslim conquest of the Levant by the Rashidun Caliphate, to later be ruled by the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Fatimid Caliphates, before being conquered by the Seljuks in the 1070s. Throughout the 12th and much of the 13th century, the land of Israel became the center for intermittent religious wars between European Christian and Muslim armies as part of the Crusades, with the Kingdom of Jerusalem being almost entirely overrun by Saladin's Ayyubids late in the 12th century. Although the Crusaders managed to first expand from their remaining outposts, and then hang on to their constantly decreasing territories for another century, in the 13th century, the land of Israel became subject to Mongol conquest, though this was stopped by the Mamluk Sultanate, under whose rule it remained until the 16th century. The Mamluks were eventually defeated by the Ottoman Empire, and the region became an Ottoman province until the early 20th century. The late 19th century saw the rise of a Jewish nationalist movement in Europe known as Zionism, as part of which Aliyah Jewish immigration to the land of Israel from the diaspora increased. During World War I, the Sinai and Palestine campaign of the Allies led to the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire. Britain was granted control of the region by League of Nations mandate in what became known as Mandatory Palestine. The British government had publicly committed itself to the creation of a Jewish homeland in the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Palestinian Arabs opposed this design, asserting their rights over the former Ottoman territories and seeking to prevent Jewish immigration. As a result, Arab-Jewish tensions grew in the succeeding decades of British administration. In late 1947, the United Nations voted for the partition of Mandate Palestine and the creation of a Jewish and an Arab state on its territory. The Jews accepted the plan, while the Arabs rejected it. A civil war ensued, won by the Jews. In May 1948, the Israeli Declaration of Independence sparked the 1948 war, in which Israel repelled the invading armies of the neighboring states. It resulted in the 1948 Palestinian expulsion and flight, and subsequently led to waves of Jewish emigration from other parts of the Middle East. Today, approximately 43% of the global Jewish population resides in Israel. In 1979, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty was signed based on the Camp David Accords. In 1993, Israel signed the Oslo I Accord with the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was followed by the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority. In 1994, the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed. Despite efforts to finalize a peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, the conflict continues to play a major role in Israeli and international political, social, and economic life. Declaration of Independence with the British Mandate of Palestine, scheduled to come to an end on the 15th of May 1948. The governing body of the Jewish community, the Jewish National Council, JNC, on the 2nd of March 1948 began work on the organization of a Jewish provisional government. On the 12th of April 1948, it formed the Lit. People's Administration, all of its members being drawn from Motzat Ham, People's Council, the temporary legislative body set up at the same time. On the 14th of May 1948, the day the last British forces left Haifa, the People's Council gathered at the Tel Aviv Museum and proclaimed the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to serve as the homeland for the Jewish people, to be known as the State of Israel. The meeting was led by David Ben-Gurion, the executive head of the World Zionist Organization, chairman of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, and soon to be first Prime Minister of Israel. The event is celebrated annually in Israel as Independence Day, a national holiday on 5 Iyar of every year according to the Hebrew calendar. After the declaration, Minhalet Ham became the provisional government of Israel, whilst Motzat Ham became the provisional state council. Paragraph 13 of the declaration provides that the state of Israel would be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. However, the Knesset maintains that the declaration is neither a law nor an ordinary legal document. The Supreme Court has ruled that the guarantees were merely guiding principles, and that the declaration is not a constitutional law making a practical ruling on the upholding or nullification of various ordinances and statutes. The Arab-Israeli War immediately following the declaration of the new state. Both superpower leaders, US President Harry S. Truman and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, recognized the new state. The Arab League members, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon and Iraq, refused to accept the UN partition plan and proclaimed the right of self-determination for the Arabs across the whole of Palestine. The Arab states marched their forces into what had, until the previous day, been the British Mandate for Palestine, starting the First Arab-Israeli War. The Arab states had heavy military equipment at their disposal and were initially on the offensive. The Jewish forces were not a state before the 15th of May and could not buy heavy arms. On the 29th of May 1948, the British initiated United Nations Security Council Resolution 50, declaring an arms embargo on the region. Czechoslovakia violated the resolution, supplying the Jewish state with critical military hardware to match the mainly British heavy equipment and planes already owned by the invading Arab states. On the 11th of June, a month-long untruce came into effect. Following independence, the Haganah became the Israel Defense Forces, IDF. The Pomak, Etzel, and Lehi were required to cease independent operations and join the IDF. During the ceasefire, Etzel attempted to bringing a private arms shipment aboard a ship called Altalina when they refused to hand the arms to the government. Ben-Gurion ordered that the ship be sunk. Several Etzel members were killed in the fighting. Large numbers of Jewish immigrants, many of them World War II veterans and Holocaust survivors, now began arriving in the new state of Israel. And many joined the IDF after an initial loss of territory by the Jewish state and its occupation by the Arab armies. From July, the tide gradually turned in the Israelis' favor, and they pushed the Arab armies out and conquered some of the territory that had been included in the proposed Arab state. At the end of November, tenuous local ceasefires were arranged between the Israelis, Syrians, and Lebanese. On the 1st of December, King Abdullah announced the union of Transjordan with Arab Palestine west of the Jordan. Only Britain recognized the annexation. History of Israel Chistovas, an area of the southern Levant, also known as Canith N, Palestine, or the Holy Land, which is the geographical location of the modern states of Israel and Palestine, from a prehistory as part of Thea, to the emergence of Nachafian culture c. 10th millennium BCE. The region entered the Bronze Age c. 2000 BCE with the development of Canaanite civilization, before being vassalized by Egypt in the Late Bronze Age. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah were established during the Iron Age. These kingdoms were important to the Levantine corridor, which saw waves of early people from Africa as the Abrahamic faith tradition, as well as to the Jewish and Samaritan people's ancestors. This has given rise to Judaism, Samaritanism, Christianity, Islam, Druzeism, Baha'ism, and a variety of other religious movements. Throughout the course of human history, the land of Israel has seen many conflicts and come under the sway or control of various polities, and, as a result, it has historically hosted a wide variety of ethnic groups. In the following centuries, the Assyrian, Babylonian, Achaemenid, and Macedonian empires conquered the region. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids vied for control over the region during the Hellenistic period. However, with the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, the local Jewish population maintained independence for a century before being incorporated into the Roman Republic. Many Jews were killed, forced to flee their homes, or sold into slavery as a result of the Jewish wars in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, following the advent of Christianity, which was adopted by the Greco-Roman world under the influence of the Roman Empire. The region's demographics shifted towards newfound Christians, who replaced Jews as the majority of the population by the 4th century. However, shortly after Islam was consolidated across the Arabian Peninsula under Muhammad in the 7th century, Byzantine Christian rule over the land of Israel was superseded in the Muslim conquest of the Levant by the Rashidun Caliphate, to, later, be ruled by the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Fatimid, before being conquered by the Seljuks in the 1070s. Throughout the 12th and much of the 13th century, the land of Israel became the center for intermittent religious wars between European Christian and Muslim armies as part of the Crusades, with the Kingdom of Jerusalem being almost entirely overrun by Saladin's Ayyubids late in the 12th century. Although the Crusaders managed to first expand from their remaining outposts, and then hang on to their constantly decreasing territories for another century. In the 13th century, the land of Israel became subject to Mongol conquest. Though this was stopped by the Mamluk Sultanate, under whose rule it remained until the 16th century. The Mamluks were eventually defeated by the Ottoman Empire, and the region became an Ottoman province until the early 20th century. The late 19th century saw the rise of a Jewish nationalist movement in Europe known as Zionism, as part of which earlier Jewish immigration to the land of Israel from the diaspora increased. During World War I, the Sinai and Palestine campaign of the Allies led to the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire. Britain was granted control of the region by League of Nations mandate in what became known as Mandatory Palestine. The British government had publicly committed itself to the creation of a Jewish homeland in the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Palestinian Arabs opposed this design, asserting their rights over the former Ottoman territories and seeking to prevent Jewish immigration. As a result, Arab-Jewish tensions grew in the succeeding decades of British administration. In late 1947, the United Nations voted for the partition of Mandate Palestine and the creation of a Jewish and an Arab state on its territory. The Jews accepted the plan, while the Arabs rejected it. The result was a civil war that the Jews won. In May 1948, the Israeli Declaration of Independence sparked the 1948 war in which Israel repelled the invading armies of the neighboring states. It led to the expulsion and flight of Palestinians in 1948, as well as waves of Jewish immigration from other parts of the Middle East. Today, approximately 43% of the global Jewish population resides in Israel. In 1979, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty was signed, based on the Camp David Accords. In 1993, Israel signed the Oslo I Accord with the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was followed by the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority. In 1994, the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed. Despite efforts to finalize a peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, the conflict continues to play a major role in Israeli and international political, social, and economic life. Declaration of Independence with the British Mandate of Palestine scheduled to come to an end. On the 15th of May 1948, the governing body of the Jewish community, the Jewish National Council, JNC, on the 2nd of March 1948, began work on the organization of a Jewish provisional government. On the 12th of April 1948, it formed the Minlat Ha-Lit People's Administration, all of its members being drawn from Motzet HAAM, People's Council, the temporary legislative body set up at the same time. On the 14th of May 1948, the day the last British forces left Haifa, the People's Council gathered at the Tel Aviv Museum and proclaimed the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to serve as the homeland for the Jewish people, to be known as the State of Israel. The meeting was led by David Ben-Gurion, the executive head of the World Zionist Organization, chairman of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, and soon to be first Prime Minister of Israel. According to the Hebrew calendar, the event is celebrated annually as Independence Day, a national holiday on 5 Iyar. After the declaration, Minhalet Ham became the provisional government of Israel, whilst Motzet Ham became the provisional state council. Paragraph 13 of the declaration provides that the state of Israel would be based on freedom, justice and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race or sex. However, the Knesset maintains that the declaration is neither a law nor an ordinary legal document. The Supreme Court has ruled that the guarantees were merely guiding principles, and that the declaration is not a constitutional Lawmaking, a practical ruling on the upholding or nullification of various ordinances and statutes. The Arab-Israeli War immediately following the declaration of the new state. Both superpower leaders, US President Harry S. Truman and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, recognized the new state. The Arab League members Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon and Iraq refused to accept the UN partition plan and proclaimed the right of self-determination for the Arabs across the whole of Palestine. The Arab states marched their forces into what had, until the previous day, been the British mandate for Palestine, starting the First Arab-Israeli War. The Arab states had heavy military equipment at their disposal and were initially on the offensive. The Jewish forces were not a state before the 15th of May and could not buy heavy arms. On the 29th of May, 1948, the British initiated United Nations Security Council Resolution 50, declaring an arms embargo on the region. Czechoslovakia violated the resolution, supplying the Jewish state with critical military hardware to match the mainly British heavy equipment and planes already owned by the invading Arab states. On the 11th of June, a month-long UN truce came into effect. Following independence, the Haganah became the Israel Defense Forces, IDF. The Palmach Etzel and Lehi were required to cease independent operations and join the IDF. During the ceasefire, Etzel attempted to bring in a private arms shipment aboard a ship called Altalena. When they refused to hand the arms to the government, Ben-Gurion ordered that the ship be sunk. Several Etzel members were killed in the fighting. Large numbers of Jewish immigrants, many of them World War II veterans and Holocaust survivors, now began arriving in the new state of Israel, and many joined the IDF. After an initial loss of territory by the Jewish state and its occupation by the Arab armies, from July the tide gradually turned in the Israelis' favor, and they pushed the Arab armies out and conquered some of the territory that had been included in the proposed Arab state. At the end of November, tenuous local ceasefires were arranged between the Israelis, Syrians, and Lebanese. On the 1st of December, King Abdullah announced the union of Transjordan with Arab Palestine west of the Jordan. Only Britain recognized the annexation. In its early years, Israel sought to maintain a non-aligned position between the but in 1952, an anti-Semitic public trial was staged in Moscow, in which a group of Jewish doctors were accused of trying to poison Stalin, the doctors' plot. Followed by a similar trial in Czechoslovakia, Esselenské trial. Israel's pursuit of non-alignment effectively came to an end as a result of this, and Israel's inability to participate in the Bonn Conference of Non-Aligned States. On the 19th of May, 1950, in contravention of international law, Egypt announced that the Suez Canal would be closed to Israeli ships and commerce. In 1952, a military coup in Egypt brought Abdel Nasser to power. The United States pursued close relations with the new Arab states, particularly the Nasser-led Egyptian Free Officers Movement and Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, establishing good relations with newly independent African states. And France, which was involved in the Algerian War, was Israel's response to diplomatic isolation. Mid to early 1960s, see also 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th governments of Israel. Mid-1950s, see also reprisal operations and Lavin affair. In the January 1955 elections, Mapai 140 seats and the Labour Party 10. Moshe Sharett became Prime Minister of Israel at the head of a left-wing coalition. Between 1953 and 1956, there were intermittent clashes along all of Israel's borders as Arab terrorism and breaches of the ceasefire resulting in Israeli Kavarets. Gaza, which is occupied by Egypt, was the location of Palestinian Fedayeen. Attacks, which were frequently planned and funded by Egyptians. Israel launched retaliatory attacks against Gaza in response to the Fedayeen attacks, which resulted in an expanding cycle of violence. In 1954, the Uzi submachine gun first entered use by the Israel Defense Forces. In 1955, the Egyptian government began recruiting former Nazi rocket scientists for a missile program. Sharat's government was brought down by the Lavon affair, a crude plan to disrupt US-Egyptian relations, involving Israeli agents planting bombs at American sites in Egypt. The plan failed when 11 agents were arrested. Defense Minister Lavon was blamed despite his denial of responsibility. The Lavon affair led to Sharat's resignation, and Ben-Gurion returned to the post of Prime Minister. Suez Crisis main article. Suez Crisis. In 1955, Egypt concluded a massive arms deal with Czechoslovakia, upsetting the balance of power in the Middle East. In 1956, the increasingly pro-Soviet President Nasser of Egypt announced the nationalization of the French and British-owned Suez Canal, which was Egypt's main source of foreign currency. The Gulf of Aqaba was also blocked by Egypt, preventing Israeli access to the Red Sea. Israel made a secret agreement with the French at Sevres to coordinate military operations against Egypt. Britain and France had already begun secret preparations for military action. It has been alleged that the French also agreed to build a nuclear plant for the Israelis. Britain and France arranged for Israel to give them a pretext for seizing the Suez Canal. Israel was to attack Egypt, and Britain and France would then call on both sides to withdraw. When, as expected, the Egyptians refused, Anglo-French forces would invade to take control of the canal. Israeli forces, commanded by General Moshe Dayan, attacked Egypt on the 29th of October 1956. On 30 October, Britain and France made their call for both sides to stop fighting and withdraw from the canal area, and for them to be allowed to take up positions at key points on the canal. Egypt refused. So, on October 31st, the Allies launched airstrikes to disarm the Egyptian Air Force. The Israelis had conquered the Sinai by November 5th. The Anglo-French invasion began that day. There was uproar in the UN, with the US and USSR for once in agreement in denouncing the actions of Israel, Britain, and France. A demand for a ceasefire was reluctantly accepted on the 7th of November. Citation needed. At Egypt's request, the UN sent an emergency force, UNEF, consisting of 6,000 peacekeeping troops from 10 nations, to supervise the ceasefire, the first ever UN peacekeeping operation. From the 15th of November, the UN troops marked out a zone across the Sinai to separate the Israeli and Egyptian forces. Upon receiving US guarantees of Israeli access to the Suez Canal, freedom of access out of the Gulf of Aqaba, and Egyptian action to stop Palestinian raids from Gaza, the Israelis withdrew to the Negev. In practice, the Suez Canal remained closed to Israeli shipping. West European dominance in the Middle East came to an end with the conflict. Nasser emerged as the victor in the conflict, having won the political battle. But the Israeli military learned that it did not need British or French support to conquer Sinai, and that it could conquer the Sinai Peninsula in a few days. The Israeli political leadership learnt that Israel had a limited time frame within which to operate militarily, after which international political pressure would restrict Israel's freedom of action. Late 1950s and 1956, to modern Orthodox and religious Zionist parties, Mizrachi and Hapoel HaMizrachi joined to form the National Religious Party. The party was a component of every Israeli coalition until 1992, usually running the Ministry of Education. Mapai was once again victorious in the 1959 elections, increasing its number of seats to 47. Labour had 7. Ben-Gurion remained Prime Minister. In 1959, there were renewed skirmishes along Israel's borders that continued throughout the early 1960s. The Arab League continued to widen its economic boycott, and there was a dispute over water rights in the River Jordan basin. With Soviet backing, the Arab states, particularly Egypt, were continuing to build up their forces. France was Israel's primary supplier of military hardware. Early 1960s see also 10th, 11th and 12th governments of Israel in 1961 AA. Herod no-confidence motion over the resurfaced Lavon affair led to Ben-Gurion's resignation. Ben-Gurion declared that he would only accept office if Lavon was fired from the position of the head of Histadrut, Israel's labor union organization. His demands were granted, and Mapai won the election in 1961 with 42 seats, keeping Ben-Gurion as PM, albeit with a smaller share of seats. Menachem Begin's Herod Party and the Liberals came next with 17 seats each. In 1962, the Mossad began assassinating German rocket scientists working in Egypt, after one of them reported the missile program was designed to carry chemical warheads. This action was condemned by Ben-Gurion and led to the Mossad director, Issa Harel, resignation. In 1963, Ben-Gurion quit again over the Lavon affair. He was unsuccessful in gaining the support of his party's Mapai for the issue. Levi Eshkol became leader of Mapai and the new prime minister. Ben-Gurion quit Mapai to form the new party, Rafi. He was joined by Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan. Begin's Herod Party joined with the Liberals to form Gahal, Mapai and Labour united for the 1965 elections, winning 45 seats and maintaining Levi Eshkol as Prime Minister. Ben-Gurion's Rafi Party received 10 seats. Gahal gained 26 seats, becoming the second largest party. Trial of Eichmann Rudolf Kastner, a minor political functionary, was accused of collaborating with the Nazis and sued. His accuser, Kastner, lost the trial and was assassinated 2 years later. In 1958, the Supreme Court exonerated him. In May 1960, Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief administrators of the Nazi Holocaust, was located in Argentina by the Mossad, later kidnapping him and bringing him to Israel. In 1961, he was put on trial, and after several months found guilty and sentenced to death. He was hanged in 1962 and is the only person ever sentenced to death by an Israeli court. Testimonies by Holocaust survivors at the trial and the extensive publicity that surrounded it has led the trial to be considered a turning point in public awareness of the Holocaust. Renewed regional tensions in 1963, Yigal Yadin began excavating. Masada, in 1964, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria developed a unified military command. Israel completed work on a national water carrier, a huge engineering project designed to transfer Israel's allocation of the Jordan River's waters towards the south of the country in realization of Ben-Gurion's dream of mass Jewish settlement of the Negev desert. The Arabs responded by trying to divert the headwaters of the Jordan, leading to growing conflict between Israel and Syria. France was Israel's primary supplier of arms up until 1966. However, in 1966, following Algeria's withdrawal, Charles de Gaulle declared that France would no longer provide Israel with arms and refused to refund money paid for 50 warplanes. On the 5th of February 1966, the US announced that it was taking over the former French and West German obligations to maintain military stabilization in the Middle East. Included in the military hardware would be over 200 M48 tanks. In May of that year, the US also agreed to provide a 4 Skyhawk tactical aircraft to Israel. In 1966, security restrictions placed on Arab Israelis were eased and efforts made to integrate them into Israeli live television programming in black and white began in 1966. On the 15th of May 1967, the first public performance of Naomi Shemer's classic song, Jerusalem of Gold, took place, and over the next few weeks, it dominated the Israeli airwaves. Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping after Syria. Egypt and Jordan gathered troops along the Israeli border 2 days later. Nasser demanded that the UNEF leave Sinai, threatening escalation to a full war. There was talk on Egyptian radio about a coming genocide. On the 26th of May, Nasser declared, "The battle will be a general one, and our basic objective will be to destroy Israel." Israel considered the Straits of Tiran closure a casus belli. Iraqi troops began to deploy to Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Egypt following the signing of defense pacts with Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. Additionally, Algeria declared that it would deploy troops to Egypt between 1963 and 1967. Egyptian troops had tested chemical weapons on Yemenite civilians as part of an Egyptian intervention in support of rebels. Israel responded by calling up its civilian reserves, bringing much of the Israeli economy to a halt. The Israelis set up a national unity coalition, including for the first time Menachem Begin's party, Heret, in a coalition. During a national radio broadcast, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol stammered, causing widespread fear in Israel. To calm public concern, Moshe Dayan, Chief of Staff during the Sinai War, was appointed defense minister. Six-day war. On the morning of the 5th of June 1967, the Israeli Air Force launched preemptive attacks, destroying first the Egyptian Air Force, and then later the same day destroying the air forces of Jordan and Syria. Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were then defeated almost simultaneously by Israel. By the 11th of June, the Arab forces were routed, and all parties had accepted the ceasefire called for by UN Security Council resolutions 235 and 200. According to Abdi al-Azim Ramadan, the Khartoum resolution, which came out of the Arab League summit on August 29, 1967, left only one option: a war with Israel. On the 22nd of November 1967, the Security Council adopted Resolution 242, the Land for Peace formula, which called for the establishment of a just and lasting peace based on Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in 1967 in return for the end of all states of belligerency, respect for the sovereignty of all states in the area, and the right to live in peace within secure, recognized boundaries. The resolution was accepted by both sides, though with different interpretations, and has been the basis of all subsequent peace negotiations. Early 1970s to late 1960s, late 1960s, see also 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th governments of Israel. By the late 60s, about 500,000 Jews had left Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. About 850,000 Jews from Arab countries, 99%, moved to Israel, France, and the Americas over a 20-year period. The land and property left behind by the Jews, much of it in Arab city centers, is still a matter of some dispute. Today, there are about 9,000 Jews living in Arab states, of whom 75% live in Morocco and 15% in Tunisia. These nations lost vast assets, including approximately $150 billion in property and goods before inflation. After 1967, the Soviet bloc, except Romania, broke off relations with Israel. Anti-Semitic purges encouraged the remnants of Polish Jewry to move to Israel. A flood of Soviet Jews applied to emigrate to Israel as a result of the victory in 1967, which fueled increased anti-Semitism and enthusiasm in the Soviet Union. The majority of Jews were targeted by the authorities and denied exit visas. Prisoners of Zion were named after a group of people who were detained. Jews were able to visit the old city of Jerusalem and pray at the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, for the first time since the end of the British Mandate, when they had been denied access by the Jordanians in violation of the 1949 Armistice Agreement. Israel's victory in the Six-Day War resulted in this. The 4-meter-wide public alley beside the wall was expanded into a massive plaza, and worshippers were allowed to sit or use other furniture for the first time in centuries. In Hebron, Jews gained access to the Cave of the Patriarchs, the second most holy site in Judaism, for the first time. Since the 14th century, previously Jews were only allowed to pray at the entrance. Rachel's tomb, a third Jewish holy site in Bethlehem, became accessible. Israel became energy independent thanks to the oil fields in the Sinai. Moshe Levinger led a group of religious Zionists in 1968 to establish the first Jewish settlement, Kiryat Arba, near Hebron. There were no other religious settlements until after 1974, Ben-Gurion's Rafi party merged with the Labour-Mapai alliance. Ben-Gurion remained an independent outsider. In 1968, compulsory education was extended until the age of 16 for all citizens. It had been 14. And the government embarked on an extensive program of integration in education. Children from predominantly Sephardi Mizrahi neighborhoods were transported by bus to newly established middle schools in better areas in major cities. After 2000, the system remained in place. In March 1968, Israeli forces attacked the Palestinian militia, Fatah, at its base in the Jordanian town of Karameh. The attack was in response to Israeli roads being mined with landmines. After destroying the camp, the Israelis retreated, but the attack was deemed unsuccessful due to the unexpectedly high number of casualties they sustained. Despite heavy casualties, the Palestinians claimed victory, while Fatah and the PLO, of which it formed part, became famous across the Arab world. Golda Meir became prime minister with the highest percentage of votes ever won by an Israeli party, winning 56 of the 120 seats after the 1969 election. Levi Eshkol died of a heart attack in his office at the beginning of 1969. Meir was the first female prime minister of Israel and the first woman to have headed a Middle Eastern state in modern times. Gahal retained its 26 seats and was the second largest party. War of attrition in early 1969. Fighting broke out between Egypt and Israel along the Suez Canal. During the War of attrition that lasted from 1969 to 1970, Israeli planes launched devastating strikes into Egypt as a response to the numerous times that Egypt shelled Israeli positions along the Suez Canal. In December 1969, Israeli naval commandos took 5 missile boats during the night from Cherbourg harbor in France. Israel had paid for the boats, but the French had refused to supply them. 5 Soviet fighters that were assisting the Egyptians in the War of attrition were shot down by Israeli forces in July 1970. After this, the United States worked to calm things down, and in August 1970, a ceasefire was agreed upon. The early 1970s. During 1971, violent demonstrations by the Israeli Black Panthers made the Israeli public aware of resentment among Mizrahi Jews at ongoing discrimination and social gaps. In 1972, the US Jewish mafia leader Meyer Lansky, who had taken refuge in Israel, was deported to the United States. Black September main article. Black September. In September 1970, King Hussein of Jordan drove the Palestine Liberation Organization out of his country. In an effort to assist the plot, Syrian tanks invaded Jordan on September 18, 1970. At the request of the US, Israel moved troops to the border and threatened Syria, causing the Syrians to withdraw. The center of PLO activity then shifted to Lebanon, where the 1969 Cairo Agreement gave the Palestinians autonomy within the south of the country. The PLO-controlled region contributed to the Lebanese Civil War that lasted from 1975 to 1990 and earned the name Fatahland from both the international press and locals. The event also led to Hafez al-Assad taking power in Syria. Egyptian President Nasser died of a heart attack immediately after and was succeeded by Anwar Sadat. Munich Massacre. Main article. Munich Massacre. At the 1972 Munich Olympics, 2 members of the Israeli team were killed and 9 members taken hostage by Palestinian terrorists. A botched German rescue attempt led to the death of the rest, along with 5 of the 8 hijackers. In exchange for the hostages of the hijacked Lufthansa Flight 615, the West German authorities released the 3 surviving Palestinians 8 weeks later without charging them. The Israeli government responded with an airstrike, an assassination campaign against the massacre's organizers, and a raid on the PLO headquarters in Lebanon, led by future Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Yom Kippur War. In 1972, the new Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, expelled the Soviet advisors from Egypt. This and frequent invasion exercises by Egypt and Syria led to Israeli complacency about the threat from these countries. In addition, the desire not to be held responsible for initiating conflict and an election campaign highlighting security led to an Israeli failure to mobilize, despite receiving warnings of an impending attack. The Yom Kippur War, also known as the October War, began on the 6th of October 1973. Yom Kippur being a day when adult Jews are required to fast. The Syrian and Egyptian armies launched a well-planned surprise attack against the unprepared Israeli defense forces. For the first few days, there was a great deal of uncertainty about Israel's capacity to repel the invaders. Both the Soviets and the Americans, at the orders of Henry Kissinger, rushed arms to their allies. The Syrians were repulsed by the tiny remnant of the Israeli tank force on the Golan, and, although the Egyptians captured a strip of territory in Sinai, Israeli forces crossed the Suez Canal, trapping the Egyptian Third Army in Sinai and were 100 kilometers from Cairo. The war cost Israel over 2,000 dead, resulted in a heavy arms bill for both sides, and made Israelis more aware of their vulnerability. Additionally, it increased tensions between superpowers. Following the war, both Israelis and Egyptians showed greater willingness to negotiate. On the 18th of January 1974, extensive diplomacy by US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger led to a disengagement of forces agreement with the Egyptian government, and on the 31st of May with the Syrian government. The war was the catalyst for the 1973 oil crisis, a Saudi-led oil embargo in conjunction with OPEC against countries trading with Israel. Severe shortages led to massive increases in the price of oil, and as a result, many countries broke off relations with Israel or downgraded relations. and Israel was banned from participation in the Asian Games and other Asian sporting events. Following the war, prior to the December 1973 elections, Gahal and a number of right-wing parties united to form the Likud, led by Begin. In the December 1973 elections, Labour won 51 seats, leaving Golda Meir as Prime Minister. The Likud won 39 seats. Yasser Arafat addressed the General Assembly when the PLO was granted observer status at the United Nations in November 1974. Later that year, the Agranat Commission, appointed to assess responsibility for Israel's lack of preparedness for the war, exonerated the government of responsibility and held the Chief of Staff and Head of Military Intelligence responsible. Despite the report, public anger at the government led to Golda Meir's resignation. The mid to late 70s, the rise of religious Zionism, the Gush Emunim movement, which was founded in 1974 by religious Zionists who adhered to the teachings of Abraham. Isaac Cook launched an organized effort to settle the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In November 1975, the United Nations General Assembly, under the guidance of Austrian Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim, adopted Resolution 3379, which asserted Zionism to be a form of racism. The General Assembly rescinded this resolution in December 1991 with Resolution 4686. In March 1976, there was a massive strike by Israeli Arabs in protest at a government plan to expropriate land in the Galilee. Late 1970s, see also 17th Government of Israel. Following Meir's resignation, Yitzhak Rabin became Prime Minister. In July 1976, Rabin ordered Operation Entebbe to rescue kidnapped Jewish passengers from an Air France flight hijacked by PFLP militants and German revolutionaries and flown to Uganda. 69. In January 1977, French authorities arrested Abu Daoud, the planner of the Munich massacre, releasing him a few days later. 70. In March 1977, Anatoly Sharansky, a prominent refusnik and spokesman for the Moscow-Helsinki Group, was sentenced to 13 years hard labor. Rabin resigned in April 1977, after it emerged that his wife maintained a dollar account in the US illegal at the time, which had been opened while Rabin was Israeli ambassador. The incident became known as the dollar account affair. Shimon Peres informally replaced him as Prime Minister, leading the alignment in the subsequent elections. The rise of Likudsi also, 18th and 19th governments of Israel, in a surprise result. The Likud, led by Menachem, began 143 seats in the 1977 elections. Labour won 32 seats. This was the first time in Israeli history that the government was not led by the left. A key reason for the victory was anger among Mizrahi Jews at discrimination, which was to play an important role in Israeli politics. For many years, talented small-town Mizrahi social activists, unable to advance in the Labour Party, were readily embraced by Begin. Moroccan-born David Levy and Iranian-born Moshe Katsav were part of a group who won Mizrahi support for Begin. Many Labour voters voted for the Democratic Movement for Change, 15 seats in protest at high-profile corruption cases. The party joined in coalition with Begin and disappeared at the next election. In addition to starting a process of healing the Mizrahi-Ashkenazi divide, Begin's government included ultra-Orthodox Jews and was instrumental in healing the Zionist ultra-Orthodox rift. Begin's liberalization of the economy led to hyperinflation around 150%, but enabled Israel to begin receiving US financial aid. Begin actively supported Gush Emunim's efforts to settle the West Bank, and Jewish settlements in the occupied territories received government support. thus laying the grounds for intense conflict with the Palestinian population of the occupied territories. In November 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat broke 30 years of hostility with Israel by visiting Jerusalem at the invitation of Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Sadat's two-day visit included a speech before the Knesset and was a turning point in the history of the conflict. The Egyptian leader created a new psychological climate in the Middle East in which peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors seemed possible. Sadat recognized Israel's right to exist and established the basis for direct negotiations between Egypt and Israel. Following Sadat's visit, 350 Yom Kippur War veterans organized the Peace Now movement to encourage Israeli governments to make peace with the Arabs. In March 1978, 11 armed Lebanese Palestinians reached Israel in boats and hijacked a bus carrying families on a day outing, killing 38 people, including 13 children. The attackers opposed the Egyptian-Israeli peace process. 3 days later, Israeli forces crossed into Lebanon, beginning Operation Litani. After passage of United Nations Security Council Resolution 425, calling for Israeli withdrawal and the creation of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon UNIFIL peacekeeping force, Israel withdrew its troops. Camp David Accords. In September 1978, US President Jimmy Carter invited President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin to meet with him at Camp David. On the 11th of September, they agreed on a framework for peace between Israel and Egypt and a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. It set out broad principles to guide negotiations between Israel and the Arab states. It also established guidelines for a West Bank Gaza transitional regime of full autonomy for the Palestinians residing in these territories, and for a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. The treaty was signed the 26th of March 1979 by Begin and Sadat, with Carter signing as witness. Under the treaty, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in April 1982. The Arab League reacted to the peace treaty by suspending Egypt from the organization and moving its headquarters from Cairo to Tunis. In 1981, Islamic fundamentalist army members opposed to Israel-Palestine peace murdered Sadat. Following the agreement, Israel and Egypt became the two largest recipients of US military and financial aid. Iraq and Afghanistan have now overtaken them. In December 1978, the Israeli Merkava battle tank entered use with the IDF. In 1979, more than 40,000 Iranian Jews migrated to Israel to escape the Islamic Revolution. Early to mid-1980s, on the 30th of June 1981, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the Acerric nuclear reactor that France was building for Iraq. 3 weeks later, Begin won again in the 1981 elections, 48 seats Likud, 47 Labour, and Ariel Sharon was made defense minister. The new government annexed the Golan Heights and banned the national airline from flying on Shabbat. By the 1980s, a diverse set of high-tech industries had developed in Israel. 1982 Lebanon War. Israel's border with Lebanon was quieter than its borders with other neighbors in the decades that followed the war in 1948. However, the PLO had complete freedom to attack Israel from South Lebanon under the 1969 Cairo Agreement. The area was governed by the PLO independently of the Lebanese government and became known as Fatahland. Fatah was the largest faction in the PLO. Palestinian irregulars constantly shelled the Israeli north, especially the town of Kiryat Shmona, which was a Likud stronghold, inhabited primarily by Jews who had fled the Arab world. Lack of control over Palestinian areas was an important factor in causing civil war in Lebanon. In June 1982, the attempted assassination of Shlomo Argav, the ambassador to Britain, was used as a pretext for an Israeli invasion aiming to drive the PLO out of the southern half of Lebanon. Sharon agreed with Chief of Staff Raphael Iten to expand the invasion deep into Lebanon, even though the cabinet had only authorized a 40-kilometer deep invasion. The invasion became known as the 1982 Lebanon War, and the Israeli army occupied Beirut, the only time an Arab capital has been occupied by Israel. Some of the Shia and Christian population of South Lebanon welcomed the Israelis, as PLO forces had maltreated them. But Lebanese resentment of Israeli occupation grew over time, and the Shia became gradually radicalized under Iranian guidance. Opposition to the war in Israel grew as a result of the constant deaths of Israeli soldiers and civilians in Lebanon. In August 1982, the PLO withdrew its forces from Lebanon, moving to Tunisia. Bashir Gemayel was elected president of Lebanon and reportedly agreed to recognize Israel and sign a peace treaty. However, Gemayel was assassinated before an agreement could be signed. And one day later, Phalangist Christian forces led by Eli Hobeker entered to Palestinian refugee camps and massacred the occupants. As many as 400,000 people, roughly 10% of the Israeli population, gathered in Tel Aviv in protest of the war as a result of the massacres. An Israeli public inquiry concluded in 1983 that Sharon, Israel's defense minister, the immediate consequences of the crisis were the loss of a third of the public's investments in the banks, the acquisition of the banks by the government at a total cost of $6.9 billion. For reference, Israel's entire GDP in 1983 was about $27 billion, and the nationalization of the major banks, Leumi, Hapolim, Hamizrachi, Discount, and Kloli. Each bank's chief executives were found guilty of criminal offenses. Raphael Recanati of Discount Bank and Mordecai Einhorn of Bank Leumi were both sentenced to 8-month prison terms. 80. Recanati's sentence was suspended on appeal when one of 5 charges was quashed. 81 as part of the settlement. The controlling interest in Discount Bank, as well as the other banks, was ceded to the government. The mid-1980s additionally see the 21st, 23rd, and 24th Israeli governments. After his release from the Soviet Union, Anatoly Sharansky met with Shimon Peres, who was the prime minister at the time. In September 1983, Begin resigned and was succeeded by Yitzhak Shamir as prime minister. The 1984 election was inconclusive and led to a power-sharing agreement between Shimon Peres of the alignment 44 seats and Shamir of Likud 41 seats. Shamir served as prime minister from 1986 to 1988, while Peres served from 1984 to 1986. In 1984, continual discrimination against Sephardi ultra-Orthodox Jews by the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox establishment led political activist Aryeh Deri to leave the Agudat Israel Party and join former Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef in forming Shoes, a new party aimed at the non-Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox vote. In the first election it participated in, the party won 4 seats and became the 3rd largest party in the Knesset for 20 years. Shas established a nationwide network of free Sephardi Orthodox schools. In 1984, during a severe famine in Ethiopia, 8,000 Ethiopian Jews were secretly transported to Israel. By July 1985, Israel's inflation, buttressed by complex index linking of salaries, had reached 480% per annum, and was the highest in the world. In order to successfully control inflation, Peres implemented emergency price control and reduced government spending. The currency known as the Old Israeli Shekel was replaced and renamed the Israeli New Shekel at a rate of 1,000 old shekalim equals 1 new shekel. In October 1985, Israel responded to a Palestinian terrorist attack in Cyprus by bombing the PLO headquarters in Tunis. In 1986, Natan Sharansky, a famous Russian human rights activist and Zionist refusnik, denied an exit visa, was released from the Gulag in return for 2 Soviet spies. South Lebanon conflict. In June 1985, Israel partially withdrew from Lebanon, leaving a residual Israeli force and an Israeli-supported militia in southern Lebanon as a security zone and buffer against attacks on its northern territory. The partial withdrawal did not end the conflict, however, but drew the IDF back into a conflict in South Lebanon with the Shia organization Hezbollah, which became a growing threat to Israel. From 1985 to 2000, the protracted armed conflict saw fighting between the Christian-dominated South Lebanon army SLA and Hezbollah al-Muslim guerrillas within the Israeli-occupied security zone, with no clear endgame in Lebanon. The Israeli military was unfamiliar with the type of warfare that Hezbollah waged, and while it could inflict losses on Hezbollah, there was no long-term strategy, with Hezbollah increasingly targeting the Galilee with rockets. The official purpose of the security zone to protect Israel's northern communities seemed contradictory. Hezbollah also excelled at psychological warfare, often recording their attacks on Israeli troops. Following the 1997 Israeli helicopter disaster, the Israeli public began to seriously question whether the military occupation of southern Lebanon was worth maintaining. The Four Mothers movement rose to the forefront of the public discourse and played a leading role in swaying the public in favor of a complete withdrawal, which would be completed in 2000. First Intifada, growing Israeli settlement and continuing. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip led to the 1987 First Intifada, motivated by collective Palestinian frustration over Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as it approached a 20-year mark. The Intifada began on the 9th of December 1987, when an Israeli Defense Forces IDF truck collided with a civilian car in the Jabalia refugee camp, killing 4 Palestinian workers. Palestinians charged that the collision was a deliberate reprisal killing, while Israel denied that the crash, which came at time of heightened tensions, was intentional or coordinated. The Palestinian response was characterized by protests, civil disobedience, and violence. There was graffiti, barricading, and widespread throwing of stones and Molotov cocktails at the IDF and its infrastructure within the West Bank and Gaza Strip. These contrasted with civil efforts, including general strikes, boycotts of Israeli civil administration institutions in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, an economic boycott consisting of refusal to work in Israeli settlements on Israeli products, refusal to pay taxes, and refusal to drive Palestinian cars with Israeli licenses. Israel deployed some 80,000 soldiers in response. Israeli countermeasures, which initially included the use of live rounds frequently in cases of riots, were criticized as disproportionate. The IDF's rules of engagement were also criticized as too liberally employing lethal force. Israel argued that Palestinian violence demanded a forceful response. In the first 13 months, 332 Palestinians and 12 Israelis were killed. Images of soldiers beating adolescents with clubs then led to the adoption of firing semi-lethal plastic bullets. 53 of the 311 Palestinians killed during the first year of the Intifada were under the age of 17, over 6 years. The IDF killed an estimated 1,162 to 1,204 Palestinians. Among Israelis, 100 civilians and 60 IDF personnel were killed, often by militants outside the control of the Intifada's UNLU, and more than 1,400 Israeli civilians and 1,700 soldiers were injured. The Intifada also saw a lot of intra-Palestinian violence. Between 1988 and April 1994, an estimated 822 Palestinians were killed for being alleged collaborators with Israel. At the time, Israel reportedly obtained information from some 18,000 Palestinians who had been compromised, although fewer than half had any proven contact with the Israeli authorities. Human rights violations committed by Israeli troops prompted a group of Israelis to establish B'Tselem, a group whose mission is to raise awareness of and encourage compliance with Israel's human rights laws. The period of sustained protests and violent riots carried out by Palestinians in the Palestinian territories and Israel would last until the Madrid Conference of 1991, though some date its conclusion to 1993 and the signing of the Oslo Accords. Late 1980s to early 2000s, late 198 OSIN. September 1988, Israel launched an OFEC reconnaissance satellite into orbit, using a Shavet rocket, thus becoming one of only 8 countries possessing a capacity to independently launch satellites into space. 2 more have since developed. This ability, the alignment and Likud, remained neck and neck in the 1988 elections. Shamir successfully formed a national unity coalition with the Labour alignment. In March 1990, alignment leader Shimon Peres engineered a defeat of the government in a non-confidence vote and then tried to form a new government. He failed, and Shamir became prime minister at the head of a right-wing coalition. Gulf. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War between Iraq and a large allied force led by the United States. With 39 Scud missiles, Iraq attacked Israel. Israel did not retaliate at request of the US, fearing that if Israel responded against Iraq, other Arab nations might desert the allied coalition. Israeli citizens and Palestinians received gas masks from Israel, and the Netherlands and the United States stationed Patriot defense batteries in Israel to guard against the Scuds. In May 1991, during a 36-hour period, 15,000 Beta Israel Ethiopian Jews were secretly airlifted to Israel. The coalition's victory in the Gulf War opened new possibilities for regional peace. And in October 1991, the US President, George H.W., a historic gathering of leaders from Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Palestine was called together in Madrid by Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, the Premier of the Soviet Union. Shamir opposed the idea but agreed in return for loan guarantees to help with absorption of immigrants from the former Soviet Union. His participation in the conference led to the collapse of his right-wing coalition. Soviet authorities finally permitted free emigration of Soviet Jews to Israel. Prior to this, Jews trying to leave the USSR faced persecution. Those who succeeded arrived as refugees. Over the next few years, some 1 million Soviet citizens migrated to Israel. Although there was concern that some of the new immigrants had only a very tenuous connection to Judaism, and many were accompanied by relatives, this massive wave of migration slowly transformed Israel, bringing large numbers of highly educated Soviet Jews and creating a powerful Russian culture in Israel. Oslo Accords. Further information: Oslo Accords and assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. See also 25th and 26th governments of Israel in the 1992 elections. The Labour Party, led by Yitzhak Rabin, won a significant victory, 44 seats, promising to pursue peace while promoting Rabin as a tough general and pledging not to deal with the PLO in any way. The Left Zionist Party, Meretz, won 12 seats, and the Arab and Communist parties a further 5, meaning that parties supporting a peace treaty had a full, albeit small, majority in the Knesset. Later that year, the Israeli electoral system was changed to allow for direct election of the Prime Minister. The hope was that this would make it harder for small parties to get concessions in exchange for coalition agreements. The new system had the opposite effect. Voters could split their vote for Prime Minister from their interest-based party vote, and as a result, larger parties won fewer votes and smaller parties becoming more attractive to voters. It thus increased the power of the smaller parties. By the 2006 election, the system was abandoned. On the 25th of July 1993, Israel carried out a week-long military operation in Lebanon to attack Hezbollah positions. On the 13th of September 1993, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization PLO signed the Oslo Accords, a declaration of principles. Better source needed on the South Lawn of the White House. The principles established objectives relating to a transfer of authority from Israel to an interim Palestinian authority, as a prelude to a final treaty establishing a Palestinian state in exchange for mutual recognition. The DOP established May 1999 as the date by which a permanent status agreement for the West Bank and Gaza Strip would take effect. In February 1994, Baruch Goldstein, a follower of the Catch Party, killed 29 Palestinians and wounded 125 at the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, which became known as the Cave of the Patriarchs Massacre. Catch had been disqualified from voting in the 1992 elections due to the racist nature of the movement. It was subsequently made illegal. Israel and the PLO signed the Gaza-Jericho Agreement in May 1994, and the Agreement on Preparatory Transfer of Powers and Responsibilities in August, which began the process of transferring authority from Israel to the Palestinians. On the 25th of July 1994, Jordan and Israel signed the Washington Declaration, which formally ended the state of war that had existed between them since 1948, and on 26 October, the Israel-Jordan Treaty of Peace, witnessed by US President Bill Clinton, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, signed the Israeli-Palestinian Interim Agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip on the 28th of September 1995 in Washington. The agreement was witnessed by President Bill Clinton on behalf of the United States and by Russia, Egypt, Norway, and the EU, and incorporates and supersedes the previous agreements, marking the conclusion of the first stage of negotiations between Israel and the PLO. The agreement allowed the PLO leadership to relocate to the occupied territories and granted autonomy to the Palestinians, with talks to follow regarding final status. In return, the Palestinians promised to abstain from use of terror and changed the Palestinian National Covenant, which had called for the expulsion of all Jews who migrated after 1917 and the elimination of Israel. The agreement was opposed by Hamas and other Palestinian factions, which launched suicide bomber attacks at Israel. Rabin had a barrier constructed around Gaza to prevent attacks. The growing separation between Israel and the Palestinian territories led to a labor shortage in Israel, mainly in the construction industry. Israeli firms began importing laborers from the Philippines, Thailand, China and Romania. Some of these laborers stayed on without visas. In addition, a growing number of Africans began illegally migrating to Israel. On the 4th of November 1995, a far-right-wing religious Zionist opponent of the Oslo Accords assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. In February 1996, Rabin's successor, Shimon Peres, called early elections. In April 1996, Israel launched an operation in southern Lebanon as a result of Hezbollah's Katyusha rocket attacks on Israeli population centers along the border. Late 1990s, see also 27th and 28th governments of Israel. The May 1996 elections were the first featuring direct election of the Prime Minister and resulted in a narrow election victory for Likud leader Benjamin Netanyahu. A spate of suicide bombings reinforced the Likud position for security. Hamas claimed responsibility for most of the bombings. Despite his stated differences with the Oslo Accords, Prime Minister Netanyahu continued their implementation, but his prime ministership saw a marked slowdown in the peace process. Additionally, Netanyahu pledged to gradually reduce U.S. assistance to Israel. In September 1996, a Palestinian riot broke out against the creation of an exit in the Western Wall tunnel. Over the subsequent few weeks, around 80 people were killed as a result. In January 1997, Netanyahu signed the Hebron Protocol with the Palestinian Authority, resulting in the redeployment of Israeli forces in Hebron and the turnover of civilian authority in much of the area to the Palestinian Authority. In the election of July 1999, Ehud Barak of the Labour Party became Prime Minister. His party was the largest in the Knesset with 26 seats. In September 1999, the Supreme Court of Israel ruled that the use of torture in interrogation of Palestinian prisoners was illegal. On the 21st of March 2000, Pope John Paul II arrived in Israel for an historic visit. Early 2000s additional information, Camp David Summit in 2000 on 25. May 2000, Israel unilaterally withdrew its remaining forces from the security zone in southern Lebanon. Several thousand members of the South Lebanon Army and their families left with the Israelis. The UN Secretary-General concluded that, as of the 16th of June 2000, Israel had withdrawn its forces from Lebanon in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 425. Lebanon claims that Israel continues to occupy Lebanese territory called Sheba. Farms, however, this area was governed by Syria until 1967 when Israel took control. The Sheba farms provided Hezbollah with a pretext to maintain warfare with Israel. The Lebanese government, in contravention of the UN Security Council resolution, did not assert sovereignty in the area, which came under Hezbollah control. In the fall of 2000, talks were held at Camp David to reach a final agreement on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Ehud Barak offered to meet most of the Palestinian team's requests for territory and political concessions, including Arab parts of East Jerusalem. However, Arafat abandoned the talks without making a counterproposal. A final agreement on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Ehud Barak offered to meet most of the Palestinian team's requests for territory and political concessions, including Arab parts of East Jerusalem. However, Arafat abandoned the talks without making a counterproposal following its withdrawal from South Lebanon. Israel became a member of the Western European and Others group at the United Nations. Israel was the only nation at the UN that was not a member of any group before this. The Arab states wouldn't let it join the Asia group, which meant it couldn't be a member of the Security Council or appoint anyone to the International Court or other important UN positions. Since December 2013, it has been a permanent member of the group. In July 2000, Aryeh Deri was sentenced to 3 years in prison for bribe-taking. Deri is regarded as the mastermind behind the rise of shoes and was a government minister at the age of 24. The investigation was hampered by political manipulation and lasted for years. Deri subsequently sued a police officer who alleged that he was linked to the traffic accident death of his mother-in-law, a key witness, who was run over in New York by a driver who had once been in the employ of an associate of Deri. Second, Intifada on 28 September 2000, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Al-Aqsa compound, or Temple Mount. The following day, the Palestinians launched the Al-Aqsa. David Samuels and Khaled Abu Tomei have stated that the uprising was planned much earlier. In October 2000, Palestinians destroyed Joseph's tomb, a Jewish shrine in Nablus. The Arrow missile, a missile designed to destroy ballistic missiles, including Scud missiles, was first deployed by Israel. In 2001, with the peace process increasingly in disarray, Ehud Barak called a special election for Prime Minister. Barak hoped a victory would give him renewed authority in negotiations with the Palestinians. Instead, opposition leader Ariel Sharon was elected PM. After this election, the system of directly electing the premier was abandoned. A lot of the Israeli public and political leadership lost faith in the Palestinian Authority as a partner in peace because of the peace process's failure. The rise in Palestinian terrorism and the occasional attacks by Hezbollah from Lebanon. Most people thought that a lot of Palestinians thought the peace treaty with Israel was just for a short time. Many Israelis were thus anxious to disengage from the Palestinians. In response to a wave of suicide bomb attacks, culminating in the Passover massacre, see list of Israeli civilian casualties in the Second Intifada. Israel launched Operation Defensive Shield in March 2002, and Sharon began the construction of a barrier around the West Bank. Around the same time, due to economic difficulties in their home nations, thousands of Jews from Latin America began arriving in Israel. In January 2003, separate elections were held for the Knesset. Likud won the most seats, 27. An anti-religion party, Shinui, led by media pundit Tommy Lapid, won 15 seats on a secularist platform, making it the third largest party ahead of Orthodox Shas. Internal fighting led to Shinwai's demise at the next election. In 2004, the Black Hebrews were granted permanent residency in Israel. The group had begun migrating to Israel 25 years earlier from the United States, but had not been recognized as Jews by the state, and hence not granted citizenship under Israel's law of return. They had settled in Israel without official status. From 2004 onwards, they received citizens' rights. The Sharon government embarked on an extensive program of construction of desalinization plants that freed Israel of the fear of drought. Some of the Israeli desalinization plants are the largest of their kind in the world. In May 2004, Israel launched Operation Rainbow in southern Gaza to create a safer environment for the IDF soldiers along the Philadelphia route. On the 30th of September 2004, Israel carried out Operation Days of Penitence in northern Gaza to destroy the launching sites of Palestinian rockets which were used to attack Israeli towns. In 2005, all Jewish settlers were evacuated from Gaza, some forcibly, and their homes demolished. Disengagement from the Gaza Strip was completed on the 12th of September 2005. Military disengagement from the northern West Bank was completed 10 days later. In 2005, Sharon left the Likud and formed a new party called Kadima, which accepted that the peace process would lead to creation of a Palestinian state. He was joined by many leading figures from both Likud and Labour. Hamas won the 2006 Palestinian legislative election, the first and only genuinely free Palestinian elections. Hamas leaders rejected all agreements signed with Israel, refused to recognize Israel's right to exist, refused to abandon terror, and occasionally claimed the Holocaust was a Jewish conspiracy. The withdrawal and Hamas victory left the status of Gaza unclear. As Israel asserted, it was no longer an occupying power but continued to control air and sea access to Gaza. Although it did not exercise sovereignty on the ground, Egypt insisted that it was still occupied and refused to open border crossings with Gaza, although it was free to do so. In April 2006, Ariel Sharon was incapacitated by a severe hemorrhagic stroke and Ehud Olmert became Prime Minister. Late 2000s and 2010s and 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected President of Iran and the Israel-Iran proxy conflict intensified. Ehud Olmert was then elected Prime Minister after his party, Kadima, won the most seats, 29, in the 2006 Israeli legislative election. On the 14th of March 2006, Israel carried out an operation in the Palestinian Authority prison of Jericho to capture Ahmad Sadat and several Palestinian Arab prisoners located there who assassinated Israeli politician Rehavam Zevi in 2001. The operation was conducted as a result of the expressed intentions of the newly elected Hamas government to release these prisoners. On the 25th of June 2006, a Hamas force crossed the border from Gaza and attacked a tank, capturing Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, sparking clashes in Gaza. On the 12th of July, Hezbollah attacked Israel from Lebanon, shelled Israeli towns, and attacked a border patrol, taking to dead or badly wounded Israeli soldiers. These incidents led Israel to initiate the Second Lebanon War, which lasted through August 2006. Israeli forces entered some villages in southern Lebanon, while the Air Force attacked targets all across the country. Israel only made limited ground gains until the launch of Operation Changing Direction 11, which lasted for 3 days with disputed results. Shortly before a UN ceasefire came into effect, Israeli troops captured Wadi Saluki. The war concluded with Hezbollah evacuating its forces from southern Lebanon, while the IDF remained until its positions could be handed over to the Lebanese Armed Forces and UNIFIL. In 2007, education was made compulsory until the age of 18 for all citizens. It had been 16. Refugees from the genocide in Darfur, mostly Muslim, arrived in Israel illegally, with some given asylum. In addition to foreign workers who overstayed their visas, illegal immigrants mostly came from Africa. The numbers of such migrants are not known, and estimates vary between 30,000 and over 100,000. An American billionaire casino owner, Sheldon Adelson, set up a free newspaper, Israel Hayam, with the express intention of reducing the influence of the dominant center-left newspaper, Yediot Aronat, and accelerating a rightward shift in Israeli politics by supporting Netanyahu. In June 2007, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip in the course of the Battle of Gaza, seizing government institutions and replacing Fatah and other government officials with its own. Following the takeover, Egypt and Israel imposed a partial blockade on the grounds that Fatah had fled and was no longer providing security on the Palestinian side, and to prevent arms smuggling by terrorist groups. On the 6th of September 2007, the Israeli Air Force destroyed a nuclear reactor in Syria. On the 28th of February 2008, Israel launched a military campaign in Gaza in response to the constant firing of Qassam rockets by Hamas militants. On the 16th of July 2008, Hezbollah swapped the bodies of Israeli soldiers Ehud Goldwasser and Eldad Regev, kidnapped in 2006 in exchange for the Lebanese terrorist Samir Kunta, for Hezbollah prisoners and the bodies of 199 Palestinian Arab and Lebanese fighters. Olmert came under investigation for corruption, and this led him to announce on the 30th of July 2008 that he would be stepping down as Prime Minister following election of a new leader of the Kadima party in September 2008. Tzipi Livni won the election, but was unable to form a coalition, and Olmert remained in office until the general election. Israel carried out Operation Cast Lead in the Gaza Strip from the 27th of December 2008 to the 18th of January 2009 in response to rocket attacks from Hamas militants. In the 2009 legislative election, Likud won 27 seats and Kadima 28. However, the right-wing camp won a majority of seats, and President Shimon Peres called on Netanyahu to form the government. Russian immigrant-dominated Yisrael Beitenu came third with 15 seats, and Labour was reduced to fourth place with 13 seats. In 2009, Israeli billionaire Yitzhak Shuva announced the discovery of huge natural gas reserves off the coast of Israel. Early 2001 OS further information 2011 Israeli social justice protests, see also 33rd and 34th governments of Israel on the 31st of May 2010. An international incident broke out in the Mediterranean Sea when foreign activists trying to break the maritime blockade over Gaza clashed with Israeli troops. During the struggle, 9 Turkish activists were killed. In late September 2010 took place direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians without success, as a defensive countermeasure to the rocket threat against Israel's civilian population. At the end of March 2011, Israel began to operate the Advanced Mobile Air Defense System Iron Dome in the southern region of Israel and along the border with the Gaza Strip. On the 14th of July 2011, the largest social protest in the history of Israel began, in which hundreds of thousands of protesters from a variety of socio-economic and religious backgrounds in Israel protested against the continuing rise in the costs of living, particularly housing, and the deterioration of public services in the country, such as health and education. The peak of the demonstrations took place on the 3rd of September 2011, in which about 400,000 people demonstrated across the country. In October 2011, a deal was reached between Israel and Hamas, by which the kidnapped Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was released in exchange for 1,027 Palestinians and Arab Israeli prisoners. In a targeted killing carried out by Israeli forces in Gaza in March 2012, the Secretary-General of the Popular Resistance Committees, Zouar al-Qassi, a senior member of the PRC, and 2 additional Palestinian militants were killed. The Palestinian armed factions in the Gaza Strip, led by the Islamic Jihad and the Popular Resistance Committees, fired a massive amount of rockets towards southern Israel in retaliation, sparking 5 days of clashes along the Gaza border. In May 2012, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reached an agreement with the head of opposition, Shaul Mofaz, for Kadima to join the government, thus cancelling the early election supposed to be held in September. However, in July, the Kadima party left Netanyahu's government due to a dispute concerning military conscription for ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. In June 2012, Israel transferred The bodies of 91 Palestinian suicide bombers and other militants as part of what Mark Reggev, spokesman for Netanyahu, described as a humanitarian gesture to PA chairman Mahmoud Abbas to help revive the peace talks and reinstate direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. 143. On the 21st of October 2012, United States and Israel began their biggest joint air and missile defense exercise, known as Austere Challenge 12, involving some 3,500 US troops in the region along with 1,000 IDF personnel, expected to last 3 weeks. Germany and Britain also participated. In response to over 100 rocket attacks on southern Israeli cities, Israel began an operation in Gaza on the 14th of November 2012, with the targeted killing of Ahmed Jabari, chief of Hamas military wing, and airstrikes against 20 underground sites housing long-range missile launchers capable of striking Tel Aviv. In January 2013, construction of the barrier on the Israeli-Egyptian border was completed in its main section. Benjamin Netanyahu was elected Prime Minister again after the Likud-Yisrael-Bittenu alliance won the most seats 3-1 in the 2013 legislative election and formed a coalition government with secular centrist Yesh Atid Party 19, rightist the Jewish Home 12 and Livni's Hatnoah 6, excluding Haredi parties. Labour came in third with 15 seats. In July 2013, as a goodwill gesture to restart peace talks with the Palestinian Authority, Israel agreed to release 104 Palestinian prisoners, most of whom had been in jail since before the 1993 Oslo Accords, including militants who had killed Israeli civilians. In April 2014, Israel suspended peace talks after Hamas and Fatah agreed to form a unity government. 2014 Gaza War main article. War in Gaza in 2014, Israeli paratroopers operating against Hamas. Tunnels during the 2014 Gaza War following an escalation of rocket attacks by Hamas. Israel started an operation in the Gaza Strip on the 8th of July 2014, which included a ground incursion aimed at destroying the cross-border tunnels. Differences over the budget and a Jewish state bill triggered early elections in December 2014 after the 2015 Israeli elections. Netanyahu renewed his mandate as prime minister when Likud obtained 30 seats and formed a right-wing coalition government with Kulanu 10, the Jewish Home 8, and Orthodox parties Shas 7 and United Torah Judaism 6. The bare minimum of seats required to form a coalition. The Zionist Union Alliance came second with 24 seats. A wave of lone wolf attacks by Palestinians took place in 2015 and 2016, particularly stabbings. Late 2010s, on the 6th of December 2017, President Donald Trump formally announced United States recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which was followed by the United States recognition of the Golan Heights as part of Israel on the 25th of March 2019. In March 2018, Palestinians in Gaza initiated the Great March of Return, a series of weekly protests along the Gaza's real border. 2020's present. Further information. 2021 Israel-Palestine crisis and 2023 Israeli judicial reform protests. See also 35th, 36th and 37th governments of Israel. The COVID-19 pandemic began in Israel with the first case detected in February 2020 and the first death being that of a Holocaust survivor in Israel. SHIELD was the government's program to combat against the virus. Nationwide lockdowns and mask mandates were present throughout the country for much of 2020 into 2021. with the vaccination campaign beginning in December 2020, along with green passes. In late 2020, Israel normalized relations with 4 Arab League countries, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain in September, known as the Abraham Accords, Sudan in October, and Morocco in December. In May 2021, after tensions escalated in Jerusalem, Israel and Hamas traded blows in Gaza for 11 days. The 2019 to 2022 political crisis featured political instability in Israel, leading to 5 elections to the Knesset over 4 years. The April 2019 and September 2019 elections saw no party able to form a coalition, leading to the March 2020 election. This election again looked to result in deadlock. But due to the worsening COVID-19 pandemic, Netanyahu and blue and white leader Benny Gantz were able to establish a unity government with a planned rotating prime ministership where Netanyahu would serve first and later be replaced by Gantz. The coalition failed by December due to a dispute over the budget, and new elections were called for March 2021. Following the March 2021 election, Naftali Bennett signed a coalition agreement with Yair Lapid and different parties opposed to Netanyahu on the right, center, and left, whereby Bennett would serve as prime minister until September 2023, and then Lapid would assume the role until November 2025. An Israeli Arab party, ROM, was included in the government coalition for the first time in decades. In June 2022, following several legislative defeats for the governing coalition, Bennett announced the introduction of a bill to dissolve the Knesset and call for new elections to be held in November. Yair Lapid became the new interim prime minister. After the 2022 elections, Netanyahu was able to return as prime minister under a coalition that included Likud, Shus, United Torah Judaism, Religious Zionist Party, Otzma Yehudit, and Noam, in what was described as the most right-wing government in the country's history. A number of the right-wing coalitions have been controversial, both domestically and internationally, with its attempts at judicial reform leading to the 2023 Israeli judicial reform protests, military actions such as the July 2023 Jenin incursion, alongside a rise in Palestinian political violence, have meanwhile resulted in an uptick in violence in the Israel-Palestine conflict, producing a death toll in 2023 that is the highest in the conflict since 2005. Gaza War.